Alrighty, so this is the opening lab for October 2021. We do this show once a month for some of our Patreon subscribers who submit opening questions, and then I come on stream after doing some research and I answer them. Let me switch over to my analysis board here and get my notes ready. Some good questions this week. I definitely had to do some research on these. And yeah, actually, let's get the first question started. And first question is from Dean. And Dean is asking, as black in the King's Indian Defense, I often run into c4, d4, e3 setups, which I don't do well against since they're less confrontational. I typically try to play, so he's talking about this thing, and that's going to be from black's point of view. I typically try to play rook e8 and e5, and or sometimes b6 and bishop b7. What else should I be thinking about versus setup / what subtleties should I look out for? Also, should the b8 knight more often go to d7 or to c6? Okay, thanks, Dean, for the question. So let's put some King's Indian positions on the board. So Dean is basically asking about setups with e3, and then there are a few of these setups. I mean, the main decision for white is whether they want to develop the bishop outside the pawn chain or not. This one is actually pretty common, where white just develops like this and keeps the bishop on c1 and often goes to b2. I would say in general this is definitely not the most dangerous line that a King's Indian player has to worry about, and actually I feel like there's multiple systems here for black that are totally acceptable. Let me show the question on the screen. There we go. By the way, guys, for this opening lab, I am going to be sticking to the questions that were submitted via Patreon. If you have follow-up questions on any specific positions we look at, feel free to ask in the chat, but I may skip over them as we have a lot of questions to get through. So yeah, Dean is asking about what to do against this kind of setup, or maybe with bishop f4 or bishop g5, which I think changes it quite a bit. Long story short, if white does develop the bishop to f4 or g5, then I think black should play for more of a c5 break, taking advantage of the fact that white's bishop is not going to be kind of defending the queen side, and so c5 to me makes more sense. Whereas with this kind of setup, when white leaves the bishop on c1, maybe develops it to b2, I think playing for e5 is probably going to be the way to go. Yeah, the classic way for black to handle this kind of thing is to play for what is known as a King's Indian attack setup, which is kind of funny because we're playing the King's Indian Defense, but the type of attack that black is playing here is very similar to the classic King's Indian attack that white plays against the French and the Sicilian and the Fischer games and all that stuff. So this is always funny because it's okay, King's Indian Defense that we're playing, but the setup is very much a King's Indian attack because black wants to play for e4, queen e7, rook e8. I think this is quite annoying for white, and you get really nice attacking chances, which is probably what a King's Indian player is looking for. So for example, queen c2, white often plays rook e8, then white sometimes tries b3 or rook e1 or rook d1, and I think it's perfectly acceptable for black to just launch the pawn forward to e4, play queen to e7 to defend the pawn, and from here all the pieces are just going to be headed towards white's king, knight f8, h5, bishop f5, and I think the position is pretty fun for black to play. There was a game I saw between Caruana and Rajabov that was pretty recent, earlier this year. It went like this: b4, knight f8, bishop b2, bishop f5, h3, h5. White played knight b3, and here Rajabov played a very strong move, g5. Just preparing to utilize this hook one day, playing for h4 and g4, and also opening up the g6 square for one of his pieces, either the knight or the bishop might use this one as well. So Fabi played d5, and then, okay, I think Caruana was totally winning, and then Rajabov ended up winning, but right here at this moment, had black played knight to g6, his position is just fantastic. Knight is coming to e5, he has h4, g4, and yeah, I think in general these positions are easier for black, especially if you're a King's Indian player. I think this is usually, the kind of thing that we're playing for. So this would be kind of my recommendation for dealing with these setups. You can also play like b6, bishop b7, and even knight c6, I think is a move here that Magnus has played, with the idea of playing for e5, especially like if castle's e5, I think black is already, I mean, just doing fantastic. It's just a great King's Indian. And if white pushes d5, then you can even drop back knight b8, or you can play for knight a5, or even knight b4 is an option here. But the point is, you provoked white to take some space. We can then chip away with either c6 or just play for e5, and again get that kind of King's Indian structure that we're looking for with the closed position. So this is also super playable, but I think the classic like knight d7, rook e8, queen e7, e4 is pretty good. Does it make sense to transpose to a Grunfeld with d5 instead of d6? Well, from a King's Indian player's point of view, it's like you don't really want to play a Grunfeld, but there are positions, and I'm glad we asked this question, because for example, let's say white plays bishop f4 here and then goes e3. I think black should play c5 in this position, once again utilizing the fact that white's bishop is not on c1, so like d5, knight h5, white is already in huge pain here because they don't want to give up the dark squared bishop, but they're going to have to. And then after something like knight c3, very typical idea here is for black to take on d4, e takes d4, and then to blast white with d5. And I wouldn't say this is a Grunfeld, it's Grunfeld-esque, but the structure of course has already changed. The real point is that black just wants to leave white with an isolated queen pawn, and not a very good version of the IQP for white. So this is a pretty typical idea. Whether you're a King's Indian or a Grunfeld player, I think it doesn't matter. But this one is quite nice for black because black's piece is already kind of set up to just go after this pawn, and otherwise knight c6, bishop e6, rook c8, all of black's pieces are just coming out very nicely. In this position, I think very, very comfortable. So there are definitely ideas like this to just play for like d5 in one move, but it's not like totally necessary. Like the move d6 here, followed by knight c6 or knight d7, I think is totally playable as well. But yeah, I do think these ideas are worth knowing about, because if you can just leave the opponent with a not so great IQP, I mean, that's, I don't know, in my experience, a pretty comfortable position for black. Okay, I think that just about wraps it up for Dean's question. So let's go to the next one. All right, next up we have Kirk. And Kirk D is asking, after 1e4, how do I approach very defensive lines such as e6, d6, and double fianchetto? Yeah, the classic Hippo. I usually build the center with d4 and get the knights out, but struggle to find the right plans to attack black. Yeah, really interesting question, Kirk. So thank you for asking, because this is something that like there isn't a lot of material out there on, just like, you know, what do you do when your opponent does this kind of thing? Or when they play, you know, the Hippo. Like the Hippo setup is generally one where black fianchettos both bishops, and I'm just going to make some random moves for white, puts both knights on d7 and e7, then goes h6 and a6. And it's a very stodgy setup. Like it is kind of hard to break through, but of course black doesn't get a lot of space. And yeah, so this kind of setup I think can be played through many different move orders, so it doesn't really make sense to study specific, like, okay, in this line, you know, you go bishop d3, queen e2 first, and then they start with g6, you go knight c3. There's too many options for black, and like, yeah, you're gonna get some opponents that just play e6, d6, and they're like, okay, you know, feel free to do whatever you want. You can play c4, you can play knight c3, knight f3, you can literally do whatever you want. I don't care. I'm not going to fight for the center. I'm not going to challenge you. You know, I'm just going to take this like super passive setup and then try to outplay you later. So yeah, what can I say about this one? I mean, I think the reason it's not explored that well, like there's not a lot of lessons out there on like how to beat the Hippo, is because like you can virtually do anything and get a good position, right? There's like, you can literally choose any setup that makes sense. Just put your pieces in the center. You can play c4, you can play not c4, you can play f4, you can play without f4, and white just has like a plethora of good setups. But whether or not you win the game is still going to be, you know, coming down to how you use the space advantage how you use the possible lead in development, and then how you play, the middle game from there with the extra space. And so, yeah, space is definitely a big advantage, especially with all the pieces on the board, right? So if you control the center and your opponent doesn't, then it's like, yeah, you already have a nice position. And so this is very little to do about the opening and just all, in my opinion, about how you play the middle game. The other thing I feel like we should keep in mind here is that most players are playing this kind of stuff in blitz. Like in my experience, I've almost never seen the Hippo in classical chess. And like when, looking at the games of my students, they're playing in open tournaments, almost never I see anyone playing this in classical chess. They're playing like normal openings, let's say mainline openings, and this kind of stuff we're mainly seeing in blitz. So we need to keep this in mind, that it's still a blitz game. Just because you get a good position out of the opening doesn't mean you're going to win 100% of the time. And the advantage of these positions when it comes to blitz games, from Black's point of view, when they get some kind of typical Hippo setup like this, it's very easy for Black to make moves here without really blundering something, right? So for a blitz game, these systems, they have their advantages because you can play a lot of moves quickly. You can, let's say, confuse your opponents because they have so many options. They spend a lot of time, trying to decide what to do. H4, not play H4, queenside castle, kingside castle. The reality is in this position, White can make like any move and have an advantage. Like you can castle queenside if you want, and then go like H4, H5. I think you got a good position. You can castle kingside and then play on the queenside. You get a good position, maybe knight E2, C3, this kind of thing. But in blitz, it's hard to choose, and then, okay, you run low on time, things start to happen, position opens up, and anyway, the game is decided with the tactics, right? So it's like if your opponent is better than you tactically, that's going to outweigh, you getting the small advantage in a 3-minute blitz game. So just something to keep in mind, that beating the system is less about knowing what to do and more about like just making good moves, continuing just to follow a consistent plan, trying to make the most out of your space advantage, not spending too much time trying to figure out what to do, not trying to play on both sides of the board. Maybe that's one kind of thing I'll point out might be a mistake. You're playing A4 and H4. It's like you got to decide where to put your king and then play on the other side of the board, right? Keep it simple. Now, I looked up some games that I thought might, let's say, demonstrate how to kind of play against these Hippo types of systems. Let me just bring them up in my notes here. So yeah, for example, this game between Grischuk and Rappert, of course. Rappert, a typical specialist in these kinds of systems. We can just play through a few moves here to see how this game proceeded. And yeah, we see here Grischuk like going for this kind of plan with knight e2, knight to g3. I think before, if he hadn't played knight c3, it would also make sense to develop this way, like knight f3, bishop d3, queen e2, c3, and then knight d2. I think this kind of setup is generally considered pretty universal. Then the knight can come around to f1 and g3. But let's just see how he played this one. So he puts the knight on g3, he goes c3 to defend the center, and then a4 and possibly a5 just to provoke some weaknesses on the queen side. So Rappert goes for the typical plan, king f8, king g8, king h7, where Black just literally does nothing. Rook e1, king g8, b4, rook c1. So White doesn't know, huge rush. He's not trying to play for like d5 or e5 too quickly. Here Black just continues to waste time. White improves the position, queen d2, puts the queen on a2. I should note this, I'm pretty sure was, like a chess.com blitz game, but it kind of shows like the typical thing that might happen. Already, okay, a5, b5, c4, and White was already just doing great here, just cracking open the c file. Black has this long-term weakness here, and might have to, I think, he had to play c6 and totally kill his bishop. So very, very simple play from Grischuk to just get a completely dominating position. And is the game over from there? No, it's still not. Like, you have a big strategic advantage, but you still have to convert it. So maybe the key here is just not to totally underestimate black's chances, and just remember that it's still a game, and just because you have a space advantage doesn't mean it's game over. You still have to play good chess to convert it. So hopefully that makes sense on this question. Long story short, you can choose all kinds of setups. You can play very aggressively with queenside castling, h4, h5, f4, go for the attack. You can also play it just very positionally, castle kingside, put your knights on f3, g3, and start pushing on the queen side, a4, b4. I think the main thing here is like try not to panic, try to just improve your position, and yeah, especially in blitz, you can't afford to be spending like tons of time, trying to come up with a plan. You just have to slowly improve your position and take things move by move. Okie dokie. All right, Kirk, hopefully that helps. Let's go to the next question. And next one comes from Ian. Actually, we can just already see it here. But let's scroll down a bit anyway. And Ian is asking, how should black and the Nimzo Indian meet for bishop d2? Yeah, let's take a look. So we have the Nimzo with d4. Knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, bishop d2. Definitely a natural move. Like a lot of people, the first time they see the Nimzo, they're like, okay, bishop d2, no problem. This one to me was never super scary. I played the Nimzo for a couple years. I think the Nimzo, is a great opening, super solid and easy for black to play. This one never really concerned me too much because, it seems like white's idea is to play a3, then recapture on c3 with the bishop. Then number one, this takes some time, and so black is usually happy to trade off the bishop as long as white spends some tempi not to double their pawns. Number two, white's bishop on c3 doesn't seem like it's all that great. Black can maybe even play d5 and shut it down that way, or if black plays for one of these setups with d6, then I think black is also pretty solid. So yeah, I think black should castle here. Now it's kind of up to white to figure out what they want to do. If they do want to play a3 here, then black should just go ahead and take. And there's different moves here for black. I think d5 is fine. I think b6 is fine. I saw some games where black was playing knight e4, which is kind of an interesting move, getting ready to just take the bishop if white allows black to double the pawns. And then on rook c1, black just develops like d6, maybe bringing the other knight to f6, b6, bishop to b7. Actually, we have a question later on about this kind of setup, and I think, yeah, this is a pretty typical version where I think black is doing absolutely fine. F5 can be played here. Again, bishop goes to the long diagonal, other knight comes to f6, and then it's kind of like a classic Nimzo where we have this nice e4 square and, yeah, very solid position around it. So I don't think this is particularly dangerous, but some players, they just play without a3, so they go for knight f3. And here there's different setups. I think black can consider playing for like b6, bishop to b7. The main line seems to be to go d5 and kind of take things into, let's say, a Queen's Gambit decline kind of structure where white's development really isn't the most active that it could be, especially with the bishop on d2. So now white typically goes e3, b6 is very common, c takes d5, now that black has played b6 and intending to put the bishop on b7, e takes d5, black should keep control over the center. And okay, there's different ways for both sides to develop from here. White is typically playing bishop d3, rook c1, castles, and playing on the c-file. It's basically like a Carlsbad structure where, okay, the bishop on d2 is not so active, but white does have the c-file and can put pressure. And black would like to play either for c5, which I think would require bringing the bishop back to e7 and then playing for c5. As well as playing for some kind of like knight e4. So this bishop goes to b7, this knight goes to e4, the rook goes to e8, second knight comes to f6, and black tries to use this square. I think it's a very, very solid approach for black. For both sides, really. Both sides get a solid position. For example, rook c1, bishop b7, bishop d3, bishop e7, castles, and c5, and I think black is doing pretty well. This move c5 is important because black can now put the knight on c6 and put a little bit of pressure on d4. And I think this is relevant, for example, if white plays like knight e5, then black has this move, knight c6, which I think is very important, and not allowing white to just play f4, because black can take on d4 and win a pawn. So, although there are some tricks, I don't think black always wins a pawn here. For example, white has this clever move, bishop e1, which I think is very funny, looking to play f4 and bringing the bishop out this way. And the point is, if black plays c takes d4, looks like black is winning a pawn. White doesn't go for this one, like takes, bishop h7. That one's not so clear because white's giving up the light square bishop. But white has this shot, knight takes c6, bishop takes, and knight e2. Very cool idea, hitting the bishop on c6 and then bringing the knight to d4 and getting a nice version of the isolated queen pawn. Well, now black has this isolated queen pawn. It's kind of a problem. White has this nice knight on d4 and is doing quite well. So there are kind of tricks like these, but in general, black can go for like bishop d6, rook e8, and can fight against this knight. But c5, again, very important just to create counterplay against the d4 pawn. Okay, so yeah, really not the most dangerous approach from black's point of view. I think this d5 and b6 setup is super solid. There are other options as well where you can just give up the bishop and play like the flamingo style. You guys are familiar with Jesse's video on the Dojo YouTube channel. If not, check out the flamingo repertoire if you want an easy life from black's point of view. Okay, hopefully that helps, Ian. Let's go to the next question, which comes from Ricker. And all right, let's take a look. So Ricker is asking, I know you like the King's Indian, and I do too. Could you go through a few variations and make some comments about them? All right, so no specific question, just like go through some lines and give some thoughts. Well, what can we say about the King's Indian? It's a great opening. Point of the King's Indian is to put this bishop on g7 and eventually try to create counterplay either along this diagonal or to force white to close the center, e5, d5, and look for a kingside attack. Now, what's great about the King's Indian is also kind of the issue. What's great is that it's very flexible, and you can play this setup against virtually anything after anything other than e4. Like if white goes e4, then you can't really play a King's Indian, right? If you play knight f6, then you get hit with e5. If you play d6, then you can play a very similar setup, but this is known as the Hippo's defense, and it's not the same as like a typical King's Indian because white hasn't really touched the c-pawn, and that means that when white castles queenside, their king is going to be a lot safer. So it's a very similar setup, but I would say that this is a worse version for black compared to when white has already pushed the c-pawn out, because that means that it's much harder for white to castle queenside. Now, after anything other than e4, you can play a King's Indian setup, which I think is great. So whether white goes for knight c3 or knight f3 or g3 and bishop g2 or not, or e3 or e4, like black is just always putting the bishop on g7, the pawn is coming to d6, black is castling, and then one day we're striking at the center with either e5 or c5. So it's kind of cool. It's like a very flexible opening, and you always know that you have something to do to create counterplay. But that also means that white has just a million different setups that they can choose, and they all have their kind of nuances and details. Okay, but generally, white has a couple of options they have to make. I think one of the biggest decisions white has to make is whether or not they want to play e4 and take a lot of space, or play something with e3, like we looked at in an earlier question, or with like a fianchetto setup with bishop to g2, where definitely this is a little bit less aggressive from white's point of view. They're not taking as much space here, but it's a very solid approach, and with the bishop on g2, white typically doesn't have to suffer the raging kingside attack like they do in other lines. With the fianchetto system, let's just talk about this one because this is one of the more popular approaches. White tries to put pressure on the queenside with the bishop on g2, but the drawback to this one is that this bishop on g2 is not on his kind of usual diagonal, and that actually gives black more chances on the queen side, believe it or not. So black has a lot of setups with like c6 and then playing against the c4 pawn, and then white's bishop is often missed on this diagonal. So yeah, pros and cons to this one. It's like less ambitious for white. Let's say white is only fighting for a small positional advantage, but the advantage from white's point of view is that they're less likely to get attacked on the king side. Although I still think black should go for a setup like knight c6 and e5, and I think this is a lot of fun from black's point of view. So that's the fianchetto setup. The main lines have always been considered to be with e4, where white just tries to take a lot of space, and then from here again has many different ways of developing. Right? There's knight f3 and bishop e2 setups, there's bishop e2 and bishop e3 setups, there's setups with f3 and knight e2, and setups with h3 and knight f3, or without knight f3 and again knight e2. So lots and lots and lots of different ways for white to play. What I try to generally advise students that I'm working with that play the King's Indian is that there's a couple of setups to keep in mind where white wants to castle queenside. So for example, if white plays with f3, or with h3. This is kind of how you remember. It's like the two pawn moves that control the g4 square. A lot of the times people are playing this way because they want to go for bishop e3, queen d2, and castle queenside. Almost like a typical English attack, right, against the Sicilian, or a Perk 150 attack, or Yugoslav attack against the dragon. This setup is pretty typical, and so yeah, whenever black puts the bishop on g7, there's going to be a lot of players who go for bishop e3, queen d2, castle queenside, bishop h6. So if your opponent is playing for a system where they're looking to castle queenside, then I think it makes a lot of sense to try to strike at the center with c5. So black can castle here, for example, and then play for c5, and trying to open this diagonal or keep the diagonal open so that it makes it very difficult for white to castle queenside. And if they do end up playing, and a lot of players do this, they'll go bishop e3, c5, d5, and then they'll play queen d2 and castle queenside. And this is very, very risky because the bishop on g7 is an absolute monster. The diagonal is open. All black needs to do is organize some kind of b5 break. You can definitely sacrifice a pawn to do this in many cases, but especially if white is castled queenside. As long as black opens lines on the queenside, black is going to be doing quite well dynamically. So this is considered an extremely risky approach for white. And yeah, I think a lot of players, experienced players that play these systems, they know not to castle queenside if this bishop is open on this diagonal. There are other setups with h3, for example, where I think it also makes sense to castle and play for c5, especially if white is looking to play for like queen d2 and castle this way. Then I think playing with c5 here makes a lot of sense, but okay, there are other setups as well. And then when it comes to the classic setups with like knight f3, castles, and bishop e2, here again, black has many choices, but this is now where I would start to suggest more setups with e5. So if your opponent is castling kingside, then I think it makes sense to play for this kind of setup, kind of the classic King's Indian with d5, knight e7, where we get this knight out of the way, we push for f5, f4, go for the kingside pawn storm, and yeah, play for this classic King's Indian attack. So if the opponent is castling kingside, then a structure with e5 makes a lot of sense to me. If they're going queenside, I would suggest playing more for a c5 plan and keeping the bishop open, and then looking for queenside counterplay. So yeah, hopefully this helps. Again, there are many different setups for white to choose, but I think the key here, like with most openings, is to play a lot of chess and get exposed to a lot of different systems, analyze your games to see if you reacted to them well or not, and over time you can definitely build up a lot of experience in these positions, and you can kind of get a feeling for them, so you always know what you're kind of trying to do. Regardless of what the opponent plays, you know what kind of ideas you're playing for, what kind of plans you're looking for, and yeah, you feel comfortable regardless of the system the opponent chooses. Okay, Ricker, hopefully that that helps. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions on any King's Indian lines you want to see further. And yeah, let's jump to the next question. All right, next one comes from Nathan. Okay, Nathan's asking, any tips on how to play against the Hungarian defense? E4, E5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop e7. Yeah, let's take a look. Okay, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop e7, d4, d6. Okay, and then I'm not really sure what my plans are as white since black is such a solid setup. I guess I've mostly studied very sharp lines of the Italian and don't know how to play the quieter games as well. Yeah, it's an interesting question. This one definitely gets played by some players that they want to avoid knight f6, knight g5 because they don't want to get into the fried liver attack, and they also maybe don't like bishop c5, c3 and these lines with the Joko piano. So some players like to play bishop e7 here because it stops knight g5, and then black can just play d6, knight f6, castle, and just get like a really solid setup. And it is solid. I don't think white can get like a huge advantage here. There's different ways of playing it. One setup that always made sense to me actually was to castle. Knight f6, play d3. Let's say black castles, white goes rook to e1. So the point of putting the rook on e1, let's say this early, is that it discourages black from any kind of d5 breaks. Because here white would play takes on d5 and then knight takes e5. And this is not a Marshall gambit. This is a very different position. You know, knight can still be developed to c3, and black just doesn't get enough for the pawn here. So I like putting the rook on e1 early, stopping black from playing d5. I think most players are going to play something like d6, a little bit more solid. And then this plan with a4 has always made sense to me as something that white could do. The idea is just to try to run the pawn up to a6, try to create some weaknesses in black's camp on the queen side, especially on the light squares, and also giving the bishop a retreat square on a2 in case of a move like knight a5. You can drop the bishop back, and yeah, you don't have to trade it off for a knight. So this one to me makes a lot of sense. After bishop e6, you can actually invite black to take, play a move like knight d2. Also can take back with the knight, but I think it makes sense to take back with the pawn at some point as well. And I feel like white gets a small advantage here. But d4 is probably actually a better move objectively. I think you can fight for a bigger edge. And then after d6, it seems like both options here for white, d takes e5 and going for the endgame. I think this one is at least slightly better for white. Knight c3, bishop e3, castle queenside. I think white is pretty active here. Or you could play for d5. I think this would maybe be my choice and take some space. Feels like most players here from black's point of view are just going to go knight b8, trying to bring the knight back to d7. And I would say this is a very comfortable position for white. I was just looking at it a bit. And it's similar to the King's Indian, but okay, black is, I think, behind a bit. The bishop is on e7, not on g7. And the key plan to remember here, from white's point of view, is to bring the bishop back to d3. So that you not only defend the e4 pawn, but you set up pushing the c pawn so that you can play on the queen side. That's kind of the key here for white. We want to play c4, put the knight on c3, and then we're playing for the queen side play. So bishop e3, b4, c5, knight d2, knight can come to c4. The rook comes onto the c file. I think white gets great play on the queen side here and is better. I mean, it's not game over. It's just a position, but white has more space. White is, I think, a little bit ahead. You can also maybe consider h3 here to stop any kind of knight g4s or bishop g4s. But in general, I think white is doing really, really well here. So this, I think, would probably be my choice. Just go d5 and then this key move bishop d3 followed by c4, knight c3, and playing on the queen side. Okay. So yeah, Nathan, I hope that helps. Kind of actually kind of a quick answer there, but I think we're done. d5, bishop d3, c4, and yeah, playing on the queen side. All right, let's go to the next question. Oh, we got Nathan in the chat. Very cool. All right. Awesome. All right, next one comes from Abu. And Abu is asking here. Oops. Perfect. Okay. Abu is asking, in roughly the 1500 to 2000 rating range, playing the Ruy Lopez as white, I started to end up in more Berlin Endgames, but I do not have any real theoretical knowledge of it after move 8, nor do I suspect my opponents have much, if any. Where should I start? Are there any tempting but disastrous mistakes for white, or likewise common errors for black that I should be on the lookout for? Is there a reliable scheme of development I can safely go after from move 8 on? Or at this rating range, would I get good return on effort for learning a bit more theory? Any recommended book or other resource? Yeah, interesting question. Is the Berlin Endgame, worth studying? Honestly, I'm not sure. But let's put it on the board. So the question is from white's point of view. Abu is saying he's getting a lot of Ruiz and black is playing knight f6 and getting the Berlin Endgame, which happens after castles. Knight takes e4, white goes d4, and now in order to kind of stabilize their situation in the center, black has to play knight d6, hitting the bishop. Here white takes on c6 for the tempo, takes on e5, trades queens on d8, king takes d8, and here we have kind of the starting position of the so-called Berlin Endgame. So quick, very, very brief, super fast history lesson. This line was considered kind of sketchy for black. Then Kramnik revived it for his 2000 World Championship match with Kasparov, proving that it's actually very, very difficult for white to prove anything here, despite what the engines were saying. And since then, this is now one of the absolute main positions in chess, and almost all the top players have played this one at some point in the repertoire, including Magnus, Caruana, Aronian, Nakamura, Giri. I mean, pretty much everyone on the top, maybe with the exception of like Kasparov himself. I'm not sure if he ever took this one up from the black side. But yeah, so long story short, like top players in the world, can't find any advantage here. So we're definitely not going to find any advantage from white's point of view. The question is just like whether these positions are worth playing for white or not. And it's a really tough question for me. Like personally, I've never been attracted to this position from white's point of view. And my recommendation to students who have to face the Berlin would be to just play d3 here and play this more of like an Italian game type of way, right? With castling, c3, knight d2, rook to e1, just playing like more of a classic structure, classic middle game structure. To me, this makes sense. Number one, I mean, these positions are also, very, very combative. And even though black is solid, it doesn't mean that white can't put pressure. And I think they're also very transferable, right? If you play this position with d3, you also will feel comfortable playing like an Italian game in the future or other lines of the Ruy Lopez that have very similar structures with d3, c3. So to me, it's always made more sense just to play this one from white's point of view and get some experience with these kinds of positions. Where when it comes to like the Berlin Endgame, this is virtually the only opening where you're going to get this exact structure, right? It's a very unique structure. White has this advanced e-pawn. White has the two bishops. Black has already moved the king. The only similar one I can really think of is the exchange Spanish, where after a6, white plays bishop takes, and we get this kind of position. But even here in the exchange Spanish, it's very, I think, unlikely for us to get the exact same Berlin structure, where white is going d4 and like getting the pawn to e5 and then like trading queens on d8, right? Even here, right, it's going to be quite different to the exact Berlin Endgame. So that's why I'm like not so sure whether this is worth learning from white's point of view. From black's point of view, if you want to play the Berlin, then absolutely, yeah, you have to know, I think, how to play this endgame from the black side. But from white's point of view, yeah, it seems like a lot of effort just to know how to play this one endgame. I would say if it's something that like you're interested in, and this goes for anyone, like if you really like the looks of this endgame and you really want to learn it, then absolutely fine. I see no issue with that whatsoever. But yeah, it might not be the most practical thing as just playing d3 in this position and yeah, just getting more experience in these classic Ruy and Italian game structures. Now, if one did want to learn how to play this position more effectively, I would definitely check out the games of Vachier-Lagrave. I mean, there's lots of players who have won this endgame from white's point of view. I think Caruana has won some games. I think he's even beaten Magnus in some games here. But MVL seems to be the guy that everyone is very impressed with. And actually, a couple of games I would check out because they were very recent, so they're just very fresh. MVL won a game against Jeffrey Zhang in the Sinkfield Cup this year, 2021. And I think that was a very interesting game. Actually, I have it here. And just to show what happened, he basically pushed his kingside pawns. This is typically White's main plan in this position. And then Black here made very big mistake opening up the h-file because White was able to go rook h1. Black was never able to connect rooks, and White already had like just decisive, overwhelming strategic advantage here because Black just has no space, and this f6 pawn is killing everything. White's pieces are great, the rooks are coming in. Yeah, he won this one super quickly. I think Black even like had to like try to give a piece to break out, and it was denied. So it was just, this is the final position, e6, rook h7 coming. So this was a total demolition. And then recently in the FIDE Grand Swiss, yeah, MVL defeated Tabatabaye, the Iranian grandmaster, in very similar style. This was that game. Where again, he pushes the kingside pawns, he goes g4, he goes f5, and then, yeah, Black ends up opening the h-file, and once again, White just takes over. It's a very similar game to his game against Jeffrey Zhang. Very similar. And yeah, he like sacks the exchange, doesn't matter, and yeah, Black was, again, e6, and Black was busted. So yeah, MVL would be, I think, the guy to study. It's just to get a feeling for how a strong player handles these positions and how it plays other very strong players. But long story short, yeah, I wouldn't recommend it unless you're really interested in learning the endgame itself. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Abu, for the question. Hopefully that was useful. Let's go to the next one. All right, a few more questions to go. All right, next question comes from Spencer Lawrence, who's asking, learning the French, the Rubinstein seems wildly attractive, answering knight d2 and knight c3. Actually, let me just put that on the board so people know what the question is talking about. So Rubinstein variation is after either knight c3 or knight d2 here. Black goes d takes e4, and then plays this structure. And so, yeah, you can play this against knight c3 or knight d2 if you're a French player and you get the same position. Okay, so the Rubinstein seems wildly attractive. I've played over Rustamov's games in the Fort-Knox variation, which is de, knight takes e4, bishop d7, and this is the so-called Fort-Knox where Black puts the bishop on c6 immediately. Bishop c6, and then often will like trade off the bishop for the knight at some point. Okay, in the Fort-Knox variation, and feel like I'll be at home in the positions. 1700 OTB at the moment with tons to learn in all areas, so value, opening, study, efficiency. Is this type of shortcut reasonable or a long-term growth trap, and I should just bite the winnower bullet sooner than later? Yeah, so interesting question. We often have some version of this question. I think we had one last month and maybe the month before. This is just classic question of like, can I learn just a simple opening and then just forget about working on the opening and just work on the middle game and the end game? And yeah, I mean, I don't think there's like a perfect answer here, or at least not one that I know of. To me, that's always made sense, but it comes down to a couple of key, let's say, key elements. So number one, the opening that you're kind of using as a stopgap, in this case, the Fort-Knox variation, it is a solid one. And yeah, I know there are grandmasters out there like Rustamov who play this, you know, in classical chess, OTB, and maybe they get slightly worse positions out of the opening because generally this is a little bit passive for Black, but they know how to handle them and they do just fine. And so, yeah, it does make sense to use kind of like a system like this where okay, you just play this, you know you're not going to get checkmated out of the opening, you're not going to run into some like crazy gambits you've never seen before. You're just going to get a structure you're familiar with, and you can play chess from there. And this really appeals to a lot of people, and there are these lines out there like the Fort-Knox variation. I think another one is the Scandi with queen to d8, where it's like there's not a ton of like sharp theory here, but black can just like develop their pieces, and white can do a bunch of different stuff, but generally black tries to, you know, just not tries to avoid like a lot of sharp theory and just get into some kind of structure that they can then play. And so if you're comfortable with playing this kind of game, then yeah, I don't really see anything so wrong with just playing these positions for a little while, as long as you like still enjoy it. So to me, I never really liked doing this, because whenever I would, you know, get this kind of position, I was like, well, I don't like this, right? I don't want to play, you know, like a passive position. So I've always wanted to play something either a little bit more dynamic, or something where like I know, because I used to play the French myself, and I would play knight f6 in this position, and I really enjoyed playing these kinds of positions, the e5 and the closed center, and black playing for the queen side play and white playing for the king side, and they're very sharp, and black has a lot of upside in these positions, because if white misplays it, black has this like ready-made queen side pressure that I enjoyed handling, so it would win me a lot of games. Now, is it more work to study, you know, this variation or the winner? For sure it is, and that's why I think it just comes down to, you know, what kind of positions you want to play, right? Like what kind of chess player do you want to be, and what kind of positions do you want to play? Because there are some players that I think don't quite make this connection. And it's like, you know, they want to be like really sharp, aggressive players. They want to play like Shirov and Tal, and then they play these like really, you know, passive openings that don't really make sense and don't really lend themselves to the kind of sharp, aggressive play that, you know, deep down they're hoping to achieve. So I think the long-term answer to this question is to try to figure out what kind of middle game positions you would love to be able to play maybe in the future, and then slowly work your way towards that. So as a French player, you know, maybe we really like these winner positions, and we would love to learn how to play this at a high level. And I think that is totally something that is worth pursuing if those positions appeal to you. Personally, I never really liked the idea of going for, let's say, this kind of structure from black's point of view. To me, I just always felt very unsure about this one. White's dark squared bishop is strong. White gets, you know, queen g4 ideas. I never really loved these positions, so they were never for me. But lots of players are very, very successful with the winner, and so 100% like super playable opening if you really, you know, feel like you kind of would enjoy this this structure. If you don't feel like you would enjoy this, then yeah, you got to look for a different long-term option and figure out the middle game positions that you do want to play. And you might discover that maybe the French isn't for you. I like to rail against the French a bit because I you know, used to play it for many years, and then I just got like sick and tired of like not having space, always getting checkmated, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to switch to e4, e5, and I never felt better. It was honestly one of the best feelings. You know, I was always suffering with this bishop on c8. Now I'm just playing e5. The bishop is always getting developed. And life was never so good as a chess player. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, you know, keep your options open. And if you just want to play the Fort-Knox variation while you look for other systems, and, you know, eventually you find something that you really connect with and you want to, you know, kind of do a deep dive and start playing that, that makes a lot of sense. So I would say, yeah, ultimately try to keep an open mind to different ideas, and once you find something that you like, then you should just dive in, bite the bullet, and then start playing it, because nothing is as good a teacher, I think, when it comes to openings as experience. Just playing the opening a lot, you're gonna learn more, you know, the first time you see the opening over the board than, you know, hours and hours of looking at it on the screen. Yeah, hopefully that helps. Again, I don't think there's a perfect answer. It's more just like comes down to finding the positions that you would like to play overall, the positions that you would like to excel at, and then working on those. And if we feel solid with the Fort-Knox, if you're like, I'm fine with, these e6, c6 structures, which, again, a lot of players do make this work. If we're cool with these kinds of positions, and you just want to work on like your endgames or like your strategic chess or your calculation, I think that's totally a reasonable approach to working on your game. Because there is a lot of stuff to study out there outside of the opening. I think that's the stuff that's, for most players, probably worth looking at. Like, how to convert a strategic advantage or improving their calculation. I mean, these are very, very fundamental skills in chess. So my overall feeling on the opening has always been, if it's not a problem, don't worry about it, right? So if you're not getting just like killed in the opening every single game, then you should work on other stuff. Work on calculation, endgames, strategy, whatever interests you. But if you are just like every game with black, just like suffering, either you're getting checkmated or you're getting squeezed, then it's like, okay, you have a problem and you have to figure out, how you're gonna develop your pieces. All right, Spencer, hopefully that helped. And thanks for the question. I think this is one that a lot of players kind of struggle with, whether they're thinking about playing the French or any other of these kind of like, let's say, easier systems. All right, next question comes from Laurent. And Laurent is asking, all right, in an online long game where I was playing white, I was hit with the line c4, e5, g3, knight c6, bishop g2, bishop c5, e3, d6, knight e2, a6, castles, bishop a7, knight bc3, h5. Aha, okay, let's put it on the board. All right, c4, e3, knight e2, a6, knight bc3, and h5. Okay, I'm very unfamiliar with this kind of play, but it looks like these e5 plus h5 ideas have become more common against the Fiat English. Yep, I've seen in the database that even c4, e5, g3, h5 has been played at high level. So my question is, do you think there's a good way for white to deal with this line, or do you think it would be safer to play a setup with knight f3 to make this early wing assault less attractive for black? And then the question continues, I don't often play the English, so I must admit I'll probably go for the easiest approach in case there's one. Yeah, I've noticed these lines as well, so definitely very topical question here. And I think I might have missed a move. We were also including, let's see, knight e2, a6, castles first, bishop a7, knight c3, h5. Though black can play this h5 in different positions as well. Yeah, so honestly, my first impression, I'm not like too impressed by this h5, h4 stuff, because I've seen a few games where white just plays h3. For example, I think on h5, h3 is a good reaction, and then black often goes for like h4 and f5. Yeah, I mean, eventually these pawns get traded, and to me it just looks like black gets a lot of light squared weaknesses. And the king on h2 is really not that unsafe for white. And then white is playing for d4 and playing against this bishop. So yeah, personally, I don't think this is something that white should really be afraid of. Now, maybe castling isn't the most accurate move. Maybe it makes more sense to start with knight bc3 and d4, and then wait to castle until later. I remember seeing one game actually recently in the U.S. Women's Championship. Begum played, I thought she had a really great opening against Talia Cervantes. And let me see if I can find exactly how that game went. So that game I think was like this: knight bc3, black played bishop a7, h3, knight ge7, castles, h5, white played d4, so very, very similar, h4, g4, f5, and then white played d5, knight b8, g takes f5. Now black took with the knight, white played knight e4, knight d7, b4, and to me it just looked like white had a great position. I mean, the knight on e4 super good. This is an outpost now, right? Because black traded off the f5 pawn. And the bishop on a7 just looks like a terrible bishop. Not that white's dark square bishop is necessarily great either, but I actually feel like white's bishop might have more of a future with bishop b2 and c5 eventually happening. And yeah, I just felt like white had a very effortless advantage here. Knight c3, queen h5, bishop f3, they went for this endgame, and yeah, white was just much, much better. This knight on e4 was just really great. So, and this wasn't even like the only way white, I think, had to get an advantage with d5. I think white could have also taken on f5 first, and then played d5 or queen c2 and kind of played against black's kingside as well, this kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know. I really don't believe in it from black's point of view. I also saw this game that MVL played. So we're seeing a lot of MVL games today. That was like this. He played knight bc3, h5, d4. So I think maybe it's important to kind of delay castling until we have knight c3 and maybe even h3 in. And so h3 here. So again, in response to h5, he goes h3, h4, g4, f5. This is usually the idea for black. Otherwise, I think there's not much sense to the advance. And yeah, here there's some options for white again, like queen c2 makes sense here, kind of eyeing the g6 square. And so black can't take twice because queen g6. And so again, white is just playing on the light squares. And then MVL's choice was really interesting. He went g5 here, just giving the pawn. And so, yeah, strategically, it's kind of tough for black. If they don't take the pawn, then this knight has to develop to e7, and black isn't getting the kingside play that they were looking for. I think white is just strategically much better. And then after queen takes g5, he goes rook g1, threatening bishop takes e6, queen e7, knight d5, queen f7. I think MVL played queen a4. I checked with the engine. It really liked queen to b3. But he just went like queen a4, bishop d2, castle queenside. It just had like a monster attack. Like he was winning in like 3 more moves. So it's kind of surprising, but like he just has this like long-term compensation. It's hard for black to develop, right? There's no knight e7 because knight takes here. And yeah, just like it looks like a very fun position with queenside castling and position kind of blowing up. Queen b3 also deserves to be checked, maybe putting pressure here, and so making life difficult for black. So yeah, kind of a cool idea. I mean, definitely hadn't seen this one before, but could be worth checking out. But yeah, it seems like, long story short, not the most dangerous approach. Definitely one that maybe is fun for black as well, but yeah, if I was playing this with white, I don't really see a reason to avoid it. I think white gets some nice play on the light squares, and from the games I've seen, it seems like black has many ways of going wrong out of the opening, and so it kind of leads to a comfortable situation for white. Okay, Laurent, hopefully that answers your question. Because yeah, in general, I just want to say I'm a fan of these knight e2 setups. I think they're not that easy for black to deal with. I think a lot of players aren't really used to them. And yeah, this bishop is often feeling very restricted on the diagonal. So I think there's a lot of upside for white in these positions. So I would definitely keep playing them. Alrighty, let's go to the next question. I think this is going to be the last one for this month's opening lab. Some great questions actually this month, I gotta say. All right, so this question is from Andrew, and Andrew's asking, in the Nimzo, I like to play a setup with b6, bishop b7, d6, knight d7, castles, knight e4, f5. Yeah, I find that I can often get to a middle game where I have trouble deciding how to develop my queen, whether to move forward with the kingside pawns, carry out a rook lift, or try and bring the queen into the attack. I'm having trouble picking the right attacking plans in these structures. I guess these sorts of positions in the queen e2, e3, and 3 knights Nimzo. Okay, yeah, Andrew, it's kind of a tough question because, of course, this one relates to a lot of different positions, and yeah, depending on white's setup and how white gets their pieces out, there could be different plans and different ideas for black. But generally, Andrew is asking about this like typical situation in the Nimzo where black ends up giving the bishop for this knight, and then plays for this kind of development. Castles, b6, bishop b7, d6, knight d7, knight e4, and so on. And earlier we looked at some similar setups like this. Hey, getting a raid from Sabina Foizor. Thanks, Sabina. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. We are actually finishing up with big opening lab. We were answering a number of opening questions, and this question is about the Nimzo and how to play this typical setup with b6, bishop b7, knight e4. And I was just saying this is kind of a classic plan for black. It also happens in the Bogo Indian quite often after knight f3, bishop b4 check, knight d2. One of the most popular ways for black to play this position is to go b6. And then when white plays a3, black just gives the bishop on d2, and the white can take with the queen, white can take with the bishop, black goes bishop b7, d6, castles, knight d7, knight e4, and then typically the pawn goes to f5 as well. So yeah, Andrew's question is like how to handle these positions, and I don't know, I don't really have a great answer. It really depends on what white does. But the plans that Andrew mentioned all, make sense. For example, let's say we make some moves on the board. Castles, let's say knight e4, knight d7, also very possible. Queen c2, f5, and then black tries to play knight d7, and either knight f6 and knight g4 can make sense if f2 is weak, or more typically the rook swings out to f6 and g6 or h6. I would say that this is kind of the classic plan. So if you're ever not sure what to do in a position and you're playing this kind of setup, rook f6 and followed by swinging the rook, even if it's not objectively correct, is often going to be leading to some pretty fun play for black. And then, okay, the queen can come out to e8, h5. You can also consider ideas of playing knight g5 to trade off this knight and bring in the queen via g5. So there's, different ways that the queen can try to enter the game. Of course, lots of nuances, lots of things white can do, but I would say this is kind of the classic plan. If for some reason you can't lift the rook or you think it's not a great idea, then I would probably put the knight on f6 and making sure that you're reinforcing the e4 square, and then the queen can live on somewhere like e7. You can even play for c5. Then you don't necessarily have to play for the kingside attack. You just try to play super solid in the center. Now going back to the Nimzo, and let's just say, for example, white plays something like queen to c2 here, castles, knight f3, d6, a3 takes, queen takes. So another very typical way that we get a similar type of position where black has given up the dark square bishop. White did not have to double the pawns here, but did have to spend some extra time, right? Taking with the queen and playing a3. And this gives black a small lead in development that they can then use to try and get some activity in this position. And again, you can kind of go for a similar plan here with bishop b7, knight e4, f5, and once again, I think this rook lift plan is kind of the main idea, and then you can decide whether to go rook h6 or rook g6. How to decide which one to do, I think it really depends on the position, but I would recommend checking out some games here. Actually, let me look up some players that you can check out that I think have some good experience in these positions. So yeah, for example, on the black side here, you have Gristrick playing these positions. You have guys like Bologan, Moisenko, Zoltan Almashi, the Hungarian grandmaster. I think he's played these positions quite a bit from black's point of view. Sergei Zhigalko, really strong grandmaster from Belarus. Sergei Tivyakov, also another really strong GM. So any of these players I think are worth checking out, like looking at their games. They get into these positions quite a bit and be worth seeing how to handle them. And then when it comes to, how to bring in the queen, it really just depends. I saw one game that was quite funny where white played knight e1 here, and black played queen h4, so immediately taking advantage. Knight e1 makes a lot of sense in this position because white wants to play f3 and shut down black's bishop, and then maybe bring the knight into d3, but this allows black to get the queen in via h4. And here Okay, so one trick worth knowing, g3, knight to g5. This is very typical and definitely a classic of the genre. Gh4, knight h3 is mates, or white plays f3, and then, okay, black is happy because black has weakened white's kingside quite a bit here. But in this game, after f3, knight g5 was played. Actually, I want to make sure, I think it was a different move order here. 1 second. I think it actually came out of this line. So I saw this one game where white went b4, rook f6, d5. Now rook g6 here makes a lot of sense. Black played c5. White played takes, knight to d4. Here black played rook h6, which, let me just say, objectively, not a great move. This was an online blitz game between two 2600 grandmasters, very, very strong players. But black goes rook h6 here with the idea that if white takes, black is playing, queen h4, like h3, knight g5, and just going all in on the attack. Now this didn't work, but it looks very scary, right? So white decided to go g3 to kind of stop this, and then black ends up playing queen h4 anyway. I mean, what a move, right? It's like, and this is why people really gravitate towards these positions, because you get a chance to find these like fantastic shots. Of course, the point here, gh4, rook g6 check, king is forced onto h1, and then knight takes f2 is mate on the board due to the double check. And yeah, the queen can't be taken, but now, of course, white's kingside is just completely crushed. Knight f3 was played, queen h3, and yeah, the light squares were just way too weak. b5, knight to g5, and it was essentially GG, knight h4 takes, and mate on g2. So not the best game played objectively, but the question was, how do you get the queen in? I thought this was a pretty funny, pretty funny demonstration. Just go queen h4, no matter what. So yeah, I would recommend checking out some of those grandmasters I mentioned and looking at their games to see how they handle the positions. There are many different moves and many different plans for both sides, so it's impossible to just give a strict, recommendation, play this, this, and this. I think you simply have to look at a lot of games and try to incorporate a lot of ideas and try to retain as much as you can. As is the case with most openings. If you want to learn how to play a position really well, I think the best approach is to find a lot of games where strong players had that kind of position and try to study how they handled it, what kinds of ideas they went for, what kinds of ideas they avoided that maybe look tempting but turns out are not so good, and slowly learning little by little as we go through more games. But hopefully that helps, Andrew, and thanks for the question. And yeah, that's gonna wrap it up. Actually, that was the last question for the opening lab. Again, lots of great questions this time around, so thanks to everyone who submitted, and hopefully the answers were useful to everyone watching as well. Okay, so that does it for the YouTube cut. Hey boss, I'm actually pretty sore. Thank you for asking. It was a lot of push-ups yesterday. I didn't think I would be sore, but yeah, actually quite sore. Although I did work out earlier today, so feeling pretty good. Trying to get those gains going. So yeah, that's gonna wrap it up for the opening lab. Hopefully you guys found it instructive. We do this once a month where we invite our Patreon supporters to submit questions, and then I go over them on stream and try to make it useful and instructive for everyone. Yeah, if you guys are interested, you can find more info on the Patreon page. I would definitely encourage you to check it out. It has a lot of previous content as well that's behind the paywall, but mainly it's one of the best ways of supporting the dojo. So even if you're not interested in like the Patreon benefits, the main reason to use it is because you like what we're doing with the streams and with the YouTube and our events and stuff, and yeah, you would like to support it. But okay, it also comes with these extra perks as well. All right, What about subscribing? Yeah, and I mean, subscribing on Twitch is also very helpful as well. Both Twitch and Patreon are useful. But yeah, I guess they come with different benefits. On Twitch, you get more Twitch benefits. On Patreon, you get more Patreon stuff.